announcement and prayer request that James Horn just gave me, and that is that some of you may know some of his kinfolk, Glenn Wiley, correct? Glenn Wiley. They found him today. He has passed away today. They found him. So be praying for the Wiley family and, of course, the Horn family at this loss. So very, very difficult during times like this. So just be praying for them throughout the rest of the day and throughout the rest of the week as well. We have a fantastic turnout for our Sunday evening service. I'm thankful for you being here. I know we have several visitors. We have several from other congregations as well, and we're just so thankful that you are here. If you are a visitor, can you please take one of those visitor cards sometime this evening and fill those out for us? We would greatly appreciate that. And of course, we started this morning with Garrett Bookout, my brother-in-law, doing a wonderful job as we started off in our lectureship on Give Me Confidence. And he just did a wonderful, wonderful job. And I'm one who have many younger brothers, and what I realize is I'm very competitive because of that. Well, I'm a brother-in-law to Garrett, and I know he's also very competitive, and it's probably because he too has a younger brother. And his younger brother is going to be speaking to us here, and I fondly called today the book off, because we had Garrett book out this morning, and we have Travis book out this evening, and they are both two fantastic preachers of the Word, and we're just so thankful for them. The first couple of months that I met these two men, I was at school with them, and, well, they were very quiet. I remember going out to eat with both of them, with my family, and not much was said. And now that I know them, you can't get them to really stop talking at all. And I'm sure you saw with Garrett's preaching this morning, and as you're going to see with Travis's preaching this evening, they are indeed wonderful, wonderful with their words and articulate in presenting the Word, the true Word of truth to us. And we're just so thankful that they are here. Travis is going to be speaking to us on confidence in the cross. Travis has been preaching now going on his 8th year at the Jackson Street Church of Christ in Monroe, Louisiana. And so we appreciate him coming. He preached this morning, got in the car, and basically has been driving ever since to get here to present these two messages to us. He is a graduate of Bear Valley. I believe he graduated in 2008. But he has been in Texas preaching and now in Louisiana for several years. We're thankful that he is here, so I'm going to leave the rest of the time to him to come and present the Word to us.
Well, good evening. It is certainly good to be here. Seriously, thank you so much for the opportunity. I always enjoy getting to do this, and this is the church that I've known about for a little while and have a tremendous amount of respect for. I have a lot of respect for all you do for the kingdom. I have a lot of respect for your ministers that you have here. They are good friends of mine. They're good, godly men, and I think you're very, very blessed to have them here. The topic that I was given is confidence in the cross. And when you think about things that you want confidence in, it's hard to come up with something better than the cross. Although at the same time, and we might not always think about this, but it's hard to come up with something harder to have confidence in than a cross. We live in a culture that has been Christianized for a very long time. We live in a world where when you see a cross, you think Christianity. When you see a cross, perhaps you think, if you are a Christian, you think the loving sacrificial gift of Jesus. You think of forgiveness. You think of the love of God manifest towards mankind. You think of a lot of good, positive things. But if you were to go back in time to when Jesus is dying on the cross, that is not what you would think when you saw a cross. You would not think anything about the love of God. You would not think anything about goodness or hope or forgiveness. You wouldn't think anything about self-sacrifice. You would think this is a gruesome instrument of torture and death. This is something reserved for people who are of no significance. Primarily, it's used for slaves. It is used for the poor. It's used for people who aren't worth very much. And it's used for people who are failures at what they did, whether it be robbery, whether it be insurrection. This is one of the favorite punishments that Rome would use on any who tried to usurp Roman authority. You send them to the cross, because the cross is a very powerful instrument of death, but it's also a very powerful message. It is a message that if you mess with Rome, you will fail and you will die. One of the things that they would often do is leave bodies on the cross to rot for days and weeks and months, because that sends a message to anyone who sees it: if you mess with us, this is your fate. The cross has always had a powerful message behind it, but the message has changed radically in Jesus Christ. In the writings of Cicero, he, a Roman lawyer and historian and author who wrote a ton of stuff, he writes about one of the governors in Italy, Gaius Verus, who lost his governorship because of a foolish mistake that he made. He made this mistake. He had someone who was a criminal crucified. And while that person was dying in agony on the cross, he was saying, "I'm a Roman citizen. I'm a Roman citizen." And Gaius Verus did not believe him and did not investigate the claim, and the man died. You know why that's a big problem? Because Roman citizens are too valuable to crucify. It was actually legally, you are not allowed to crucify a Roman citizen. If you look at church history, you can see that Jesus was crucified. Peter was probably crucified. Paul, not crucified. You know why? Paul was a Roman citizen. Paul at least had the honor of a more dignified death, which is a beheading. That's a much cleaner and more dignified way to go, rather than writhing in agony on a cross for hours and hours and hours and possibly a day until you eventually die. Crucifixion was something that was reserved only for people who were not worth very much at all, or for people who rose up against the Roman Empire. There is, many of you have probably heard of the name Spartacus. Spartacus led the most famous slave revolt in the history of the Roman Empire. He led a slave revolt about 70 years or so before Jesus was born, that lasted literally for years before the Romans eventually sent troops in there and wiped the thing out. He was able to garner thousands upon thousands upon thousands of fellow fighters and slaves trying to gain their freedom. They actually had a plan to go up through the Italian Alps and people returned that way, but they had a hard time getting out of Italy. Rome sent different magistrates to them and different local authorities, and they were routed over and over again until eventually they unleashed a very large army against this slave revolt. But once Rome unleashes its army, there's just not much you can do. What they did was they took 6,000 leaders of the revolt, and along the most famous highway, it's still there to this day, from Rome to Capua, it's called the Appian Way, they crucified 6,000 of them, and they left their bodies up there for permanently. And it was a message to anyone who crossed along that highway: do not mess with Rome. You will die. You will die a gruesome, horrible death. That's what the cross meant. And so to say, hey, let's have confidence in the cross is really kind of an ironic, paradoxical thing to say. It's not the type of thing that anyone at the time Christianity was beginning would make sense to them. Which is why Paul, in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, when speaking about the message of the cross, says this: "For the word of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God." Or consider verse 22. "For indeed Jews seek for signs and Greeks search for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified. To Jews a stumbling block, and to Gentiles foolishness. But to those of us who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God." When you see the cross, hopefully you see the power of God and the wisdom of God on full display, even though to the rest of the world it might look like a message of foolishness. It might be a stumbling block. Because to say that Christ is the word that means Messiah, God's anointed and chosen one, is the one who died on the cross, would be one of the most foolish things that you could say. Because that's not what anyone expected the Christ or the Messiah to do. One of the common titles that's used for this messianic figure is Son of Man. It comes from Daniel chapter 7. And if you read Daniel chapter 7, you have this vivid image. Daniel looks out at the sea and he sees these beasts coming out of the sea. The first one he sees is a lion with eagle's wings, powerful, impressive animal. If a lion's not impressive enough, imagine an eagle's wings on it. A lion that can fly, that's not an animal that you want to mess with. That's an animal of death and destruction. That represented the Babylonian Empire. Shortly after that, he saw a bear coming out, and this bear was massive and had one shoulder bigger than the other shoulder. It was chewing on a couple of ribs, and it stood there, and again, a powerful animal of doom and destruction, something that you would not want to mess with. Third, an animal comes out, and it's a leper, and it has 4 wings on it. Incredible speed, incredible agility and might and strength. Again, an animal you don't want to mess with, and these each seem to represent corresponding empires, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, until finally the 4th animal comes out. This one's not even described as an animal. The other ones you get an image like a bear or a lion or something. This one's just called the undescriptive word beast. It's just a beast. And it has heads and horns, and it's terrifying, and it's just the worst thing you could conjure up. It comes out, and it is blaspheming, and it is horrible. And you see all of these kingdoms of men that come out upon the seashore, and it's at that time you see rolling on the clouds one like a son of man. And he goes to the Ancient of Days who sits upon the throne, and he gets a kingdom. And this kingdom is one that is unlike the lion kingdom or the bear kingdom or the leper kingdom or the beast kingdom. It's not a kingdom of death and doom and destruction. It is a kingdom where, when you read about it, all people of all tongues praise and worship and give honor and glory to the one who sits on the throne and to the Son of Man forever and ever. Amen. It is a kingdom of praise where all peoples come together. It is this beautiful picture of a kingdom. But what happens when you see that is you're expecting there's going to be a kingdom coming, and it's going to be greater and more superior to all other kingdoms. It's going to be far more powerful than the lion or the bear or the beast or the leper. It's going to be a kingdom where all people of all tongues are able to praise God together, and there's one figure like a son of man who's going to bring it about. This is the figure that they call Messiah. This is the figure that they call Christ or Christos, the figure who is going to rule, the figure that the Jews are longing for. Because the thing is, you look at Jewish history, and you have promises made to Abraham that through his seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Then you have promises to David. David's given this kingdom. He sits on a throne. They have autonomy. They have a secure border. They have wealth. They have power. They have a military. Under Solomon, it gets even better. And you're looking at this kingdom, and you're thinking, God has made promises, and you're starting to see them come to fruition. Even Egypt is amazed at the wisdom of Solomon. And then you look at this, and you say, okay, God's promises are coming to fruition, but then what happens? The kingdom splinters, there's civil war, there's unrest, there's other nations that come and cause problems. Assyria wipes out the northern nation of Israel in 722, and they lead campaigns against southern Judah that cause death and devastation. After Assyria leaves, you have the Babylonians who come in. They march into Jerusalem, destroy the city walls, destroy the temple, burn it to rubble, take people captive for 70 years. And you know what happens when the children of Israel return back home? They do rebuild the temple. They rebuild their walls, but the temple doesn't have the same glory as it formerly did. People weep when they see it. In the book of Ezekiel, there's this image of the presence and the glory of God that was there in the temple, rising up above the cherubim, rising up over the temple, rising above the city, and eventually leaving and going to the mountains to the east of the city. And the presence and glory of God leaves the temple desolate before the Babylonians come in and destroy it. When the children of Israel returned from captivity, they didn't have a king anymore. They didn't have who was their king? They had a governor, Zerubbabel. They had some political leaders, but their kingdom was gone. They were always under domination or occupation by some foreign ruler, or there were times of intense persecution from these foreign rulers. Like, for example, there was a Greek king, Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He came into Jerusalem. He built a gymnasium there, a Greek gymnasium. He established his own high priest to be high priest in Jerusalem. He put idols to Zeus in the holy place in the temple, or the holiest place in the temple. He offered swine upon the altar, and he made laws against things like Sabbath observance. He made laws against things like circumcision and their food laws, because he was trying to Hellenize the Jewish people, meaning make them Greeks, make them like everyone else. And the identity of these people is dying, and they have a family who rises up called the Maccabees. They lead a revolt, and it's successful, at least for a time. They're able to actually get some independence. They try to establish a kingdom again called the Hasmonean dynasty. It doesn't last long, and also in order to get their independence, they got help from another nation. That nation they made a treaty with was Rome. Well, Rome eventually becomes the next power of the world, and Rome occupies their land to where they don't have any authority. Rome sets kings over them like Herod, sets governors over them like Pontius Pilate. They don't have the authority to exercise capital punishment. They're not their own nation anymore. They pay taxes not to their own king. They don't have a king. They pay taxes to Caesar now. They have returned from captivity, but they've never fully experienced what they had with King David. And they're longing for some sort of Messiah, some sort of anointed one, some sort of God-chosen, hand-picked king who would give them their kingdom back, like a son of man who comes riding on the clouds and receiving a kingdom from the Father. And lo and behold, here comes the Messiah. And he's able to do incredible things. He's able to feed 5,000 at once. You know what would make a great military leader? Someone who you didn't have to worry about feeding an army, because he can get a couple loaves of bread and a couple of fish and feed them all right there. You know what would be pretty great in a military leader? Someone who can heal those who are injured in battle. Believe it or not, someone who can actually raise the dead. All of these things they see Jesus doing. After they see him feed the 5,000 in John 6, they actually physically try to take him and make him king, because they're thinking, this is it. He's the one who can do all of the things we've been longing for and hoping for. And you know what? I believe Jesus could have done those things. If Jesus wanted to destroy the Roman Empire, he could have in the blink of an eye. Jesus has that kind of power and authority behind him. But instead, Jesus was arrested and was brought before the Romans and was condemned to death and was beaten and was made weak and died on a Roman cross between a couple of criminals. Nothing glorious about it. People walked by mocking, shaking their heads as they saw him up there. It wasn't the type of thing where people realized that at that moment the world was changing forever. People saw it and they saw a cross. They saw failure. They certainly didn't see confidence. For early Christians to go out and take this message and preach the word of the cross, when Jews heard it, it was a stumbling block. You can imagine. The Messiah, the son of David, the son of man who receives this kingdom from on high, he was nailed to a cross and died? I don't buy it. To Greeks, it was foolishness. You're telling me the king of all the world isn't the guy who sits on the throne ruling the world in Rome. You're telling me it was the criminal who was 30 years old, a carpenter's son who died on a cross. He's truly the king and Lord and Messiah? Yeah, right. That's a foolish message. It was really, really hard to preach that message. Yet for Paul, he somehow found a way to have tremendous confidence in that message. So much so that when he saw the cross, he didn't see failure and weakness and death. He saw a source of life and hope. He saw a source of wisdom. He saw truly the wisdom and power of God. So what is it? What happened? I want to walk through the Gospel of Mark with you just a little bit tonight. And we can see that this is a message that was really, really hard for Jesus to get his disciples to understand. Even they struggled with it. Anyone who hears this message for the first time is going to find it a really hard one to accept. We're used to it. We see crosses all the time. We know the message. We love the message. But I want you to imagine hearing it for the first time, or at least being a disciple and trying to understand it as you're going through this journey with Jesus. It's not an easy one. Turn with me to Mark chapter 8. Mark chapter 8, we're going to see how some of these different dynamics play out. Jesus is doing something that is unprecedented. Jesus is going to try to explain to his disciples that the Son of Man, the one who's the glorious, God-chosen king and ruler of a kingdom greater than any this world has ever seen, is also going to share the same identity as the servant of Isaiah 53. If you've read Isaiah 53, there's this servant who suffers on behalf of God's people. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteem him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. You hear about that, and there were a lot of interpretations of who this servant figure was prior to Jesus and even after Jesus. If you were to pick up a Jewish commentary, I have a Bible called the Tanakh. It is a Jewish Old Testament, has a running commentary by it, and they talk about who this servant is. And most theories prior to Jesus and even in modern day Judaism are that the servant is either Israel itself, and there are some reasons in the text that lead them to think that, or that the servant is perhaps some prophet who suffered while trying to do the will of God. But Jesus is going to say that servant who suffers and bleeds and dies on behalf of God and his people, and that Son of Man who receives a glorious, powerful kingdom are one and the same. And he's the first person we've ever seen do that. Interpret the Messiah as being the suffering servant who gives his life a ransom for many. But that's exactly what Jesus is going to do, and it's going to take his disciples a while to see it. After coming to the realization that he is the Christ in Mark chapter 8, verse 29, this is the scene at Caesarea Philippi. Jesus is talking to his disciples, and Peter's the one who says, verse 29, and Jesus continued questioning them, but who do you say that I am? And Peter answered and said to him, you are the Christ. Right, that's the Messiah. That's Daniel chapter 7. You're the one who's going to give us our kingdom back. He's going to restore the kingdom to Israel. You're the one who's going to give us autonomy and freedom from the Romans. You're the one who's going to save the day, and we can put our hopes in you. He says, you are the Christ. And then Jesus says in verse 30, and he warned him to tell no one. Now that's odd, right? Imagine you were told, don't tell anyone that Jesus is the Christ. You might have a problem with that. If the government passed a law that we weren't able to tell anyone that Jesus was the Christ, we would have to disobey that law. We would say, no, we're going to do that. But all of a sudden, Jesus is the one here saying it. Why would Jesus tell Peter to keep that message silent? Well, I think we'll find out here in just a second. Verse 31. This is where Jesus finally reveals to his disciples what the Christ or what the Messiah is going to do, what the Son of Man's vocation is on earth. Verse 31, and he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and 3 days later rise again. So Jesus is with them. They say, you are the Christ. He says, don't tell anyone. Here's what the Son of Man, the Christ, the Messiah, here's what this man is going to do. He's going to be rejected. He's going to be despised. He's going to be killed. And 3 days later, he'll rise again. Notice verse 32. He was stating the matter plainly. Jesus doesn't often do that. He often says things in veiled terms. But here, he just explicitly explained, this is what will happen to the Messiah. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Do you know why Peter's rebuking him? Because Peter's read Daniel 7. Peter does not think that's what happens to the Messiah. Peter's saying, no, you're the Christ. The Son of Man is the one who rides on the cloud, receives the kingdom, receives glory, power, and honor, whips the Romans. We get important positions in his kingdom. We rule the world. Your story's a little bit mixed up. He's not the one who dies on a Roman cross. That's what happens to criminals and failures, not the Messiah, King of the world. That's Peter's problem with this. This will never happen to you. You're the Messiah. You're the Christ. We just covered this. You're getting your story wrong. By the way, if Jesus tells you about the Christ and then you go and rebuke him for it, probably you shouldn't be preaching about the Christ yet. Remember when Jesus said, tell no one? Why do you think he said that? Because Peter, if he goes out and starts preaching that Jesus is the Christ, he's going to preach the wrong Christ. He's going to preach a Christ that doesn't suffer and that doesn't die in Jerusalem. He's going to preach a Christ that doesn't die and isn't raised from the dead. He's going to preach the wrong type of Christ and Messiah. And so Jesus, before he will let them speak about him, has to explain a little bit better to them about who he is. And so Peter rebukes Jesus, verse 33. Jesus turns around and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter. And he said, get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on God's interests, but man's. How is Peter doing that? By thinking the Messiah is going to be the one who actually brings me glory and power. The Messiah is the one through whom we're going to rule the whole world again. We're going to have a kingdom again. And so then Jesus needs to start teaching them the attitude they should have as servants of the Messiah. Don't think about how it's going to benefit man. Think about how God is using this. Verse 34, and he summoned the crowd with his disciples, and he said to them, if any man wishes to come after me, he must deny himself. All right, don't put your interests on man's. Deny yourself. Take up your cross and follow after me. Messiah is going to die, and guess what? If you really want to follow him, that means a death to you also. Verse 35, for whoever wishes to save his life, that's what the kingdom would be. It would save your life from the Romans. Whoever wishes to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. By the way, there are people who actually did and still actually do lose their life for the sake of the gospel. That's what following Jesus in its grandest terms looks like. Verse 36, for what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his own soul? That idea of gaining the whole world, that's not a hypothetical. That's what they're actually thinking the Messiah is going to do. You're going to gain the whole world. They're going to be the ruling power of the world, not the Romans, them. God's chosen people through whom he would bless all nations. That's the promise to Abraham. That's what they're waiting for. That's the Daniel 7. All people of all tongues are going to worship this one. And Jesus is saying, what profit is it if you gain the whole world, but you lose your soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words, that's what people were of the cross. People are ashamed of the cross. The cross is a shameful, agonizing, embarrassing death. Jesus despised the shame of the cross. There was shame that came with it. He says, whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he comes in the glory with his Father and the holy angels. All right, skip forward a little bit to Mark chapter 9 and look at verse 9. Jesus has just transfigured before them on a mountain with Moses and Elijah. This incredible scene. Jesus is transfigured before them. They see Moses and Elijah, which is just this remarkable thing. And as they're coming, God again speaks and says, this is my beloved son, listen to him. This is the second time in Mark that a voice has come from heaven saying that Jesus is the very Son of God. Verse 9, it says, as they were coming down from the mountain, Jesus gave them orders not to relate to anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man rose from the dead. Now that's fascinating. He says, again, just like with the Christ, don't tell anyone. With this, he says, don't tell anyone, but he gives a time limit to it. Until you see the Son of Man risen from the dead. Why that? Notice the next phrase, verse 10. And they seized upon that statement, discussing with one another what rising from the dead meant. What does it mean he's going to rise from the dead? He's talking about like the end of time when we all raise from the dead. That's what the Jews were expecting when it came to resurrection. They did not expect their Messiah to raise from the dead. You know why? They didn't expect their Messiah to die. That wasn't part of Jewish messianic expectation at all. They weren't expecting a Messiah to be killed and to rise again. And so when Jesus says, don't tell anyone until after the Son of Man has risen from the dead, you don't know what they're thinking. Are they thinking end of time? Are they thinking some sort of spiritual resurrection time? What does he mean, raised from the dead? Don't forget the fact that he just told them in chapter 8 that he's going to be killed, raised from the dead. But remember the response to that. It wasn't to believe it. It was to rebuke him. Well, right here, they see the transfiguration, and he still says, don't tell anyone, because you're going to preach the wrong Son of God. You're going to preach the wrong Messiah. Don't tell anyone until after the resurrection, because I think that is when they'll be able to start seeing for themselves what Jesus' ministry is all about. Prior to the resurrection, it seems like they're going to miss it. Look at chapter 9. Mark chapter 9 and verse 31. This is the second time that Jesus gets them together and tries to explain in clear detail what he's going to do in Jerusalem. Mark chapter 9 and verse 31 says, for he was teaching his disciples and telling them, the Son of Man is to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and when he has been killed, he will rise 3 days later. Then verse 32, but they did not understand this statement, and they were afraid to ask him. All right, so the last time he told them, they said, no, that's not what happens, and they got rebuked for it. This time he says it, and they still don't get it. They don't understand that's not what happens to the Messiah. This doesn't make sense, but now they're not going to bring it up to him. Instead, what they're going to do is have a conversation with each other. Verse 33 says, they came to Capernaum, and when they were in the house, he began to question them. What were you discussing along the way? But they kept silent, for on the way they had discussed with one another which of them was the greatest. All right, that's quite a conversation to have right after Jesus tells you, hey, I'm going to die in Jerusalem. They ignore it. They don't ask him about it. Instead, they say, by the way, which one of us is truly the greatest? That's not how I want people to respond if they find out that I'm going to die. I would rather, perhaps a little bit more concerned. But no, they're just ignoring what he's saying, and they're talking about their own greatness. Why? Because they've found the Messiah. And you know what the Messiah is going to bring? Greatness. He's going to bring glory and power and wealth. And so they're discussing which one of us is going to be the greatest. Which one of us will have the most prominent position in this new kingdom? Which one of us will be vice president or secretary of state? Which one of us, and they start going through, which one of us will be the greatest in the kingdom? And Jesus has to explain to them, just like the Messiah is not going to be the one seated on this glorious throne in Jerusalem wearing a crown with all people bowing down before him. Rather, he's going to be the one who dies on a cross. He's kind of flipping the narrative of what power really is. What Jesus is going to tell them is true greatness in the kingdom is not what you think it is. Verse 35, sitting down, he called the 12 to him, and he said, if anyone wants to be first, he shall be last of all. I tell you, the Messiah is the most perfect picture of that. You think, who's first in God's kingdom? It's last. Who is last? It's the one who dies on a cross. It doesn't get laster than that. It doesn't get lower than that. And that's what the Messiah does himself. And he's calling his disciples to follow in this same paradoxical, upside-down pattern of greatness coming through service rather than greatness coming through the glory and honor and wealth of men. And so, verse 36, he takes a child and he sets them before them, and taking him in his arms, he said, whoever receives one child like this in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives not me, but the one who sent me. Finally, look with me at Mark chapter 10. Mark chapter 10 and verse 32. Mark chapter 10 and verse 32, they are actually getting to Jerusalem now. They're about to go through Jericho. Jericho's a city just, it's down the hill from Jerusalem a little ways. It's a steep hill to get from Jericho to Jerusalem, but they're getting there. And Jesus is making his final trip to Jerusalem where he's going to be crucified. He's going to get there. He's going to cleanse the temple. When that happens, the ball is now rolling. The clock has started, and the crucifixion is imminent. Well, in Mark chapter 10, he's walking with his disciples, and he's going to one last time, in the most clear and vivid detail he can, explain to them what the cross is all about. Verse 32, and they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. And they were amazed, and those who followed were fearful. And again, he took the 12 aside, and he began to tell them what was going to happen to him. And he said, behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles. And they will mock him and spit on him and scourge him and kill him. And 3 days later, he will rise from the dead. Okay, so that is clear. He's going to have a Jewish trial. He's going to be handed over to the Gentiles. They're going to mock him. They're going to beat him. They're going to kill him. And then he'll rise 3 days later. You know what their response is? Verse 35. James and John, the two sons of Zebedee, came to Jesus saying, Teacher, whatever we want you to do for us, give to us. Whatever it is that we ask, we want you to do for us. And so, verse 36, Jesus says, and what do you want me to do for you? And they said, grant that we may sit one on your right and one on your left in your glory. All right, this question, by the way, is not about a seat on some heavenly throne. This is a question saying, okay, we're going to Jerusalem. You're the Messiah. You're about to become king. Can we have your two most prominent seats, one on your right and one on your left, when you are now reigning gloriously? And Jesus responds in verse 38, you do not know what you are asking. Again, they've missed it. And he actually is going to explain to them that they don't want what he's about to go through. They don't want the baptism that he's about to be baptized with or the cup with which he's about to drink. And so he explains this to them. Verse 41, the other 10 disciples, hearing this, the 10 began to feel indignant with James and John because they're thinking, hey, they're trying to get promotions without us. They're talking to the king. They're trying to get elevated up, and they're leaving us behind. So verse 42, and calling them to himself, Jesus said, you know that those who are recognized as rulers over the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. That's what they're wanting. They're wanting to do that. They're wanting to be rulers. And he says, you know how this works, right? The Gentiles, they lord it over. You look at the Romans, the people in the Senate, the emperor, the people who are designated as kings over various locations, they lord it over people. They rule over them. They do so with an iron fist. He says in verse 43, "But it is not this way among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you shall be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many." A servant who gives his life for the many. The Son of Man, Daniel 7, is a servant, Isaiah 53, who gives his life for the many. That's what Jesus is doing, and that's what no one had seen before. But in order to have confidence in the cross, it changes the whole way you view the world. It changes the whole way you view greatness and power. It changes the way you view wealth. It changes the way that you view respect. It changes the way that you view service and power and ruling, which is why elders. We think of elders as people who are the heads, they're shepherds, they're the ones you follow. And what are they called to be? Servants. You look at the whole power structure of the kingdom of God, and it's one where the Messiah dies on a cross. What are we called to do? We're not called to carry our thrones, but to carry our crosses. We're called to be people who live lives of self-sacrificial service for the sake of others. The cross is pictured in the New Testament as the moment where God shed his blood that we might be saved. And our salvation is central to the message of the cross. But the cross is also used as the paradigm in which we live from this point forward. What I mean is, when you read about Christian unity, you know what the example is of how to get Christians to get along with one another? It's the cross. Philippians chapter 2, Jesus, who died on the cross, is hailed as the example of self-sacrificial love for others. And Christians are called to imitate that in our lives with one another. You want strong marriages? Look to the cross. Husbands, love your wives as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her. The way that we live, the way that we treat one another, Jews and Gentiles, there was this wall separating them of law. And you know what broke down that law, that wall, that law? It was the cross of Jesus Christ. The cross brought people together, making peace through the blood of the cross. The cross is not only our source of hope and salvation, but it's also our example of how we treat our wives. It's our example of how we treat our fellow brothers and sisters. It's our example of how we treat people who are different than us. It's our example of how we treat even our enemies. Notice Jesus on the cross, dying in agony, yet calling out to God, "Forgive them, they do not know what they are doing." If you find yourself in life not knowing how to treat an enemy, think about the cross. If you find yourself in life suffering persecution and not knowing how to respond, think about Jesus on the cross. If you find yourself in life having a hard time getting along with a brother or sister in Christ, think about the message of the cross. When you find yourself having trouble in your marriage with your spouse driving you crazy, think about the message of the cross. The cross is our hope of salvation. The cross is the hope of peace in a world that struggles so hard to find peace. The cross is what brings it. I have confidence in that. I have confidence in what Jesus did on the cross for me. And though it might be hard to see, I think you can see lives that have been utterly transformed by it. You can read the New Testament written by people whose lives have been utterly transformed by it. And the cross, if you're going to truly come to have confidence in it, I think the best way to do it is to live it out in your own life. Paul says, "I've been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives within me." And that's our call this evening, to live out the message of the cross with confidence. Thank you.
Thank you, Travis. Appreciate you so much and challenging us to the way we think of the cross and have confidence in that. Here in just a few short minutes, Travis will be speaking to us once again, and we'll take a short break. And during this break, as we've scheduled a little bit different tonight as we've moved into our lectureship schedule, if you were not able to partake of the Lord's Supper this morning, we'll meet in the chapel here during this break. We'll be able to do that together and remember Christ and the sacrifice he made for us during this time. But appreciate you, Travis, and look forward to your next session as you preach to us on confidence in our prayers. Thank you.